the beginning, there was only darkness and the whisper of divine purpose moving across the face of the deep. But from that primordial void emerged light, then land, then life itself in all its staggering complexity. The ancient world that would cradle humanity's earliest civilizations was unlike anything we might recognize today. It was a place where gods walked among mortals, where the boundaries between heaven and earth seemed gossamer thin, and where one man's journey would alter the course of human history forever. This is the story of Abraham, father of nations, friend of God, a wanderer who would become the cornerstone of three great faiths. His name echoes through millennia, whispered in synagogues, churches, and mosques across every continent. Yet for all his towering significance, Abraham began as something far simpler. He was a man born into a world we can scarcely imagine, shaped by forces we struggle to comprehend, called to a destiny that would ripple outward through time itself until it reached this very moment. To understand Abraham, we must first understand his world. The ancient Near East of the early second millennium before the Common Era was a tapestry of city-states, nomadic tribes, and emerging empires. This was the Bronze Age, a time when humanity had learned to bend metal to its will but had not yet forgotten the old ways, the ancient rhythms of migration and survival that had governed human existence since time immemorial. The great river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia and the Nile in Egypt had given birth to civilizations of breathtaking sophistication. Massive ziggurats pierced the sky, their stepped sides reaching toward the heavens, as if humanity itself sought to storm the gates of the divine. The cities of Mesopotamia hummed with life. Uruk, Babylon, Nineveh. These were not mere settlements, but centers of learning, commerce, and religious devotion. Cuneiform script, pressed into wet clay tablets by countless scribes, recorded everything from astronomical observations to business transactions, from epic poetry to legal codes. The people of these cities worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses, each with their own domains, their own temples, their own demands for sacrifice and devotion. Anu, god of the heavens; Enlil, lord of wind and storm; Inanna, goddess of love and war. These deities were not distant abstractions but immediate presences, capricious powers who could bless or curse on a whim. Into this world of many gods and many nations, a child was born in the city of Ur. We know him first as Abram, a name that means exalted father, though the bitter irony of this name would not become apparent until much later. His father was Terah, a man whose occupation remains shrouded in tradition and scholarly debate. Some ancient sources claim Terah was a maker of idols, crafting the very images of gods that filled the temples and homes of Ur. If true, this detail adds a layer of profound irony to the story that would unfold. The father who carved representations of false gods would sire the son who would shatter those very notions, who would introduce to the world a revolutionary concept that would fundamentally alter human consciousness. Ur itself was a marvel of the ancient world. Archaeological excavations have revealed a city of staggering sophistication. The great ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nanna, dominated the skyline. Its massive brick structure, rising in 3 tiers, could be seen for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain. The city's streets were laid out in an organized grid, a sign of urban planning that would not be seen again for centuries. Houses of baked brick, some 2 stories tall, lined these streets. The wealthier citizens enjoyed homes with central courtyards, multiple rooms, and even primitive drainage systems. This was no primitive settlement, but a thriving urban center, perhaps home to tens of thousands of people. The economy of Ur was equally complex. Merchants traveled along well-established trade routes, bringing exotic goods from as far away as the Indus Valley and the Mediterranean coast. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar wood from Lebanon, copper from Oman. The royal tombs of Ur, discovered by archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, revealed treasures of astounding beauty and craftsmanship. Golden headdresses, intricate jewelry, musical instruments decorated with precious stones. This was a civilization at its zenith, confident in its power and permanence. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity and order lurked profound anxieties. The gods were demanding and unpredictable. Natural disasters, disease, military defeat, these were not seen as random occurrences but as signs of divine displeasure. The people of Mesopotamia lived in a world of omens and divination, constantly seeking to discern the will of their gods through the examination of animal entrails, the observation of celestial phenomena, the interpretation of dreams. Life was precious and precarious, infant mortality was high, warfare was constant. The great cities rose and fell with dizzying rapidity, conquered and reconquered by successive waves of Akkadians, Sumerians, Amorites, and others. It was into this world of anxiety and uncertainty that the divine would break through in an unprecedented way. But the story does not begin with a dramatic theophany or a burning bush. It begins with a family, with ordinary people living ordinary lives in an extraordinary place. Abram had brothers, Nahor and Haran. The text of Genesis gives us these names, but little else about their early lives. We know that Haran died in Ur, in the land of his birth, a detail that seems almost casual, but which carries within it the weight of tragedy. A son dying before his father was a rupture in the natural order, a grief that words could scarcely contain. Haran left behind a son named Lot, who would figure prominently in the story to come. Abram took a wife, a woman named Sarai, whose name means princess. Here again, the ancient text is spare in its details, but those details it does provide are significant. We are told, almost in passing, that Sarai was barren. She had no children. In the ancient Near East, this was not merely a personal disappointment, but a social catastrophe. A woman's value was intimately tied to her ability to produce heirs, particularly male heirs. Barrenness was seen as a curse, a sign of divine disfavor. For Abram, whose very name meant exalted father, the irony must have been almost unbearable. An exalted father with no children. A man whose lineage would end with him. The text tells us that Terah took his family and set out from Ur, intending to go to the land of Canaan. Why? What prompted this migration? The biblical narrative offers no explanation for Terah's decision to leave the prosperous, sophisticated city of Ur for the uncertainties of a long journey to a distant land. Some scholars have speculated about economic factors, political upheaval, or even divine promptings that the text does not record. The historical context suggests several possibilities. This was a period of significant migration and upheaval in Mesopotamia. The third dynasty of Ur, which had brought stability and prosperity to the region, was collapsing under pressure from invading Amorite tribes and Elamites from the east. Perhaps Terah was fleeing instability, seeking security in a new land. Whatever the reason, the family did not reach Canaan. Instead, they settled in a city called Haran, located in what is now southeastern Turkey, near the modern border with Syria. Haran, like Ur, was a center of moon god worship. The name itself may derive from the Akkadian word for journey or caravan, suggesting its importance as a way station on ancient trade routes. Here, in this intermediate place, neither the old home nor the intended destination, Terah lived out the remainder of his days. He died in Haran at the age of 205 years. If we take the biblical chronology at face value, the ages recorded in Genesis present us with one of the many mysteries that surround these ancient narratives. Were people really living to such advanced ages? Or do these numbers carry symbolic or mathematical meanings we have lost? Some scholars suggest that these long lifespans represent a literary device, a way of spanning vast periods of history in a genealogical framework. Others point to possible differences in how years were calculated, or propose that the harsh realities of ancient life may have been different in ways we cannot fully recover. Whatever the explanation, the text presents these ages matter-of-factly, without comment or explanation, as if they required no justification. It is after Terah's death that the real story begins. Abram was 75 years old. No longer a young man even by our standards, well into old age by ancient Near Eastern life expectancy. He had spent decades in Haran, perhaps comfortable, certainly established. He had flocks and herds, servants, accumulated wealth. He had his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot. What he did not have still was a son. The dream of progeny, of leaving a legacy, must have seemed increasingly distant with each passing year. An old man married to an old woman, both long past the age of childbearing. The biological window had not merely closed, but had been sealed shut by time itself. And then came the call. The text of Genesis chapter 12 presents it with stark simplicity. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." There is no preamble, no explanation of how this communication occurred. Was it an audible voice, a vision, an internal knowing that carried the weight of absolute conviction? The text does not say. What it does convey is the radical, almost absurd nature of what was being asked. Leave everything, your country, the physical place that grounds your identity, your people, the social network that provides meaning and security, your father's household, the family structures that define who you are and where you belong. Go to a land I will show you. Not even a destination is specified. No map, no coordinates, no detailed itinerary. Just go, trust, move forward into absolute uncertainty based on nothing but a promise, a voice, a call that could not be ignored. And then come the promises themselves, and they are staggering in scope. I will make you into a great nation. This to a childless man of 75 married to a barren woman. The promise is not merely unlikely, but biologically impossible. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. This last promise is perhaps the most extraordinary of all. Not just personal blessing for Abram and his descendants, but universal blessing. Through this one man, through this one family, somehow all the families of the earth would find blessing. The implications of this divine speech are difficult to overstate. Here, emerging from the mists of ancient history, is a revolutionary idea. Not a local deity tied to a specific place or people, but a universal God speaking to one man about blessings for all humanity. Not a capricious deity demanding appeasement, but a God who initiates relationship, who makes promises, who acts in history with purpose and intention. This is the birth of ethical monotheism, the idea that there is one God who is concerned with justice, righteousness, and the welfare of all peoples. The implications would take centuries to fully unfold, but the seed is planted here, in this encounter between the divine and an elderly nomad in Haran. What must Abram have thought? Did he hesitate? Did he doubt? Did he demand proof or signs? The text gives us none of this interior struggle. It simply says that Abram went as the Lord had told him. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran. They set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. The journey itself is passed over in silence. How long did it take? What challenges did they face? What conversations took place around evening campfires as they moved through unfamiliar territory? We're not told. The narrative focus is not on the journey, but on the obedience, the response, the first step of faith into an unknown future. Canaan, the land they entered, was itself a world of complexity and diversity. This narrow strip of territory, sandwiched between the Mediterranean Sea and the Citron Desert, served as a land bridge connecting the great civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Armies and merchants alike traversed its length, making it a place of constant contact, conflict, and cultural exchange. The Canaanites themselves were not a single people, but a collection of city-states and tribal groups, each with their own kings, their own gods, their own ways of life. The religion of Canaan was characterized by fertility cults and rituals designed to ensure agricultural abundance. The chief god was El, a somewhat remote creator deity. More immediately important was Baal, the storm god who brought rain and thus life to the crops. Asherah, goddess of fertility, was widely worshipped, often represented by wooden poles or living trees near sacred sites. The religion involved sacred prostitution, child sacrifice, and ecstatic rituals that would have seemed barbaric to later monotheistic sensibilities. Yet in its own context, Canaanite religion was an attempt to engage with the fundamental mysteries of existence, to ensure survival in a harsh environment where drought could mean death. Into this religious landscape came Abram with his radical new understanding of the divine. He built altars, not temples. He called on the name of the Lord, the God who had spoken to him, who had made promises to him. But he built no permanent structures, conducted no elaborate rituals. His worship was simple, direct, personal. This was not the religion of a settled people, but of a wanderer, someone whose God was not tied to a place, but to a promise. The journey through Canaan took Abram to several locations that would later become significant in Israel's history. He passed through the land to the site of Shechem, located in a valley between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. Here the Lord appeared to him again and said, To your offspring I will give this land. Another promise, another impossibility. Abram had no offspring. Yet here was a promise that his descendants, who did not yet exist, would possess this land that was currently occupied by other peoples. Abram built an altar there, marking the place as sacred, as a site of encounter with the divine. The land stretched before them like a promise written in sand and stone, and Abram walked it with the confidence of a man who had heard the voice of the Eternal. Yet between promise and fulfillment lay a chasm that would test every fiber of his being, every assumption about divine intention, every hope carried across the desert from Ur and Haran. The journey that began with departure now entered its most turbulent phase, where faith would collide with circumstance, where human nature would wrestle with divine purpose, where the simple act of survival would demand choices that echoed through generations. Sarai walked beside him, her silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. She had left everything, the comfort of established life, the rhythms of a world she understood, to follow this vision that possessed her husband. In Canaan, they found not the peaceful Inner-Zetens they might have imagined, but a land already thick, with people, with cities, with competing claims and ancient roots. The Canaanites were not wanderers but dwellers, their towns fortified, their fields cultivated for generations, their gods numerous and demanding. Abram and his household moved through this occupied territory like ghosts of a future not yet born, claiming nothing yet promised everything. The famine came without warning, as these things do in lands where rain is miracle and drought is judgment. The sky turned to brass, the earth to dust, and the promise of abundance withered like grain in a waterless field. Abram faced his first great test, not in confrontation with enemies, but in the quiet desperation of diminishing resources. His flocks needed pasture, his people needed bread, and Canaan offered neither. To the south lay Egypt, that ancient civilization along the Nile where famine was unknown, where the river's predictable flooding ensured harvest, regardless of the capricious heavens. The decision must have torn at him. Was leaving Canaan a failure of faith or a reasonable response to immediate crisis? Did divine promise exempt him from practical action, or did it require him to preserve what he had been given? They descended into Egypt, and here the narrative reveals something profound about the character of this man chosen for greatness. Abram was no plaster saint, no figure of unwavering righteousness immune to fear and moral compromise. As they approached the border of that great kingdom, he looked at Sarai and saw not just his wife, but a woman whose beauty might be his death sentence. Egyptian power was absolute, pharaonic desire unchallenged. If the Egyptians knew she was his wife, they might kill him to possess her. Fear spoke louder than trust in that moment. He asked her to lie, to claim she was his sister, trading her protection for his survival. The deception worked too well. Sarai's beauty did indeed catch the attention of Pharaoh's officials. They praised her before their king, and she was taken into the royal household. Abram received gifts, compensation for his sister, flocks and herds and servants, wealth accumulating while his wife resided in the palace of Egypt's ruler. The text does not dwell on Sarai's thoughts, her fear, her sense of abandonment, but the silence screams. Here was the woman promised to be mother of nations, offered up to preserve the life of the man who had made that promise possible. The contradiction staggers. The great plan seemed to be unraveling through the very actions of its central figure. Then the plagues came, not the devastating signs that would later attend Moses, but afflictions severe enough that Pharaoh's wise men traced them to their source. Somehow the connection was made, the deception uncovered. Pharaoh summoned Abram with the terrible disappointment of a powerful man betrayed by someone beneath his station. "What have you done to me?" he demanded. "Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she was your sister, so that I took her as my wife?" The Egyptian ruler, worshipper of foreign gods, stood in moral judgment over the bearer of divine promise, exposing a failure that cut to the heart of Abram's character. They were expelled from Egypt, sent away with all the wealth Abram had accumulated, but also with the weight of shame and the bitter knowledge that the promise could be endangered by its own recipient. Yet in this failure lay seeds of future significance. Among the gifts Abram received in Egypt was a maidservant, an Egyptian woman named Hagar. She enters the story quietly, property transferred between men, her own desires and dreams unrecorded, but her presence would catalyze events that continue to reverberate across millennia. They returned to Canaan, to the altar Abram had built between Bethel and Ai, returning quite literally to the place of worship and promise, but nothing returns unchanged. The household that came back from Egypt was vastly wealthier. Their flocks and herds multiplied, their servants increased, and with prosperity came new complications. Lot, Abram's nephew, who had journeyed with him from the beginning, had also prospered. The land that barely supported them before now strained under the combined weight of their success. The herdsmen began to quarrel, fighting over pasture and water, those essential resources that mean life or death in arid country. Abram saw the danger immediately. Conflict between their camps could destroy the fragile unity that had sustained them through upheaval and displacement. More than that, division within his own extended family would mock the promise of becoming a great nation. With remarkable generosity, he offered Lot first choice of the land. Though Abram was the elder, though he was the one who had received the divine call, he gave his nephew the prerogative. The whole land lay before them. "Let there be no strife between us," he said, "for we are kinsmen. If you take the left hand, I will go to the right, or if you take the right hand, I will go to the left." Lot lifted his eyes and surveyed the options before him. To the east, the Jordan Valley spread green and well-watered, lush as the garden of the Lord, rich as the land of Egypt. The cities of the plain prospered there, Sodom and Gomorrah and their neighbors, centers of commerce and civilization. To remain in the hill country meant harder living, less certain resources, the challenges of terrain that resisted easy cultivation. Lot chose what his eyes could see, what immediate judgment valued. He chose the plain, the cities, the apparent abundance, and in choosing separated himself from the bearer of promise. After Lot departed, the voice came again to Abram. "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward, for all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever." The promise expanded even as the immediate family contracted. "Walk through the length and breadth of the land," the voice commanded, "for I will give it to you." Abram moved his tent to Hebron, to the oaks of Mamre, and there he built another altar, marking the land with worship, claiming it not by conquest but by devotion. Then war came to Canaan, and with it Abram's transformation from wandering herdsman to military leader. 4 kings from the east, great rulers of powerful cities, swept down in a campaign of conquest and tribute collection. They battled 5 kings of the Jordan Valley, and in the conflict Sodom and Gomorrah were defeated, their populations carried away as captives. Among the prisoners was Lot, his household, his possessions, everything he had chosen now stripped away by forces beyond his control. Word reached Abram that his kinsman was taken. The response was immediate and reveals capabilities that had not previously been evident. Abram led forth his trained men, 318 of them, born in his household and loyal to their master. He divided his forces, attacked by night, and pursued the conquering kings north to Dan and beyond. The military campaign succeeded brilliantly. He recovered all the possessions, brought back Lot and his goods, the women and the people. The herdsman had become a warrior. The wanderer had assembled and commanded a fighting force. The promise-bearer had demonstrated that faith did not preclude action, that trust in divine purpose could coexist with strategic planning and courage. Returning from the victory, Abram encountered 2 kings whose responses to his triumph could not have been more different. The king of Sodom came out to meet him, ready to negotiate the division of spoils. But first came another figure, mysterious and majestic Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of God Most High. This enigmatic character appears suddenly, bringing bread and wine, blessing Abram in the name of God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High who has delivered your enemies into your hand. Abram gave him 1/10 of everything, acknowledging a priesthood that predated his own calling, recognizing in Melchizedek something that transcended tribal or family religion. The king of Sodom's offer was pragmatic. "Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself." It was generous by the standards of ancient warfare, where victors claimed both plunder and prisoners. But Abram had just received blessing from the priest of God Most High, and his vision had been clarified. "I have lifted my hand to the Lord. God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. Wealth from Pharaoh had led to complications. Wealth from the king of Sodom would create obligations that might compromise the singular dependency on divine provision that the promise required. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield and your very great reward. The reassurance suggests that fear was present, that the aftermath of conflict and the rejection of material gain had left Abram vulnerable to doubt. His response was the cry of a man whose patience was wearing thin. O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. You have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. The complaint was reasonable, even inevitable. Years had passed since the initial call in Haran. The promise spoke of nations and descendants like dust of the earth. Yet Sarai remained barren, Abram remained childless, and the most likely inheritor of everything he had built was a servant from Damascus. Promises without fulfillment become mockery. Faith stretched too long without evidence approaches the breaking point. The response came immediate and dramatic. God brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. The night sky over Canaan blazed with countless points of light, a visible infinity that dwarfed human counting, and this vast multitude would descend from a man who had no child. The audacity of the claim matched the impossibility of the situation, and the text records a moment of profound significance. Abram believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. This crediting of faith as righteousness would echo through theological reflection for millennia, becoming foundational to understanding the relationship between human trust and divine acceptance. But belief coexisted with questions. When God identified himself as the one who brought Abram from Ur to give him the land to possess, Abram asked, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? The question was not doubt but desire for confirmation, for something tangible to anchor faith in times of uncertainty. The answer was a covenant ceremony, ancient and solemn and dark with meaning. Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought these, cut them in half except the birds, and laid each half over against the other. Birds of prey came down on the carcasses, and Abram drove them away, protecting the sacrifice, maintaining the sacred space. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. In that darkness came revelation of future suffering. Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. The vision unveiled time, stretched promise across centuries, revealed that fulfillment would come through suffering and waiting, that justice itself operated on timescales beyond individual lifetimes. The land could not be possessed yet because its current inhabitants had not yet accumulated sufficient guilt to warrant dispossession. Moral mathematics governed divine action, and Abram's descendants must endure slavery before they could receive inheritance. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. A theophany, a visible manifestation of divine presence, enacted the covenant ritual alone. Normally, both parties to a covenant would walk between the severed animals, invoking upon themselves the fate of the animals should they break the agreement. But here God alone passed through, binding himself by oath while Abram lay in darkness and sleep. The promise became unconditional, dependent not on Abram's performance, but on divine commitment. 10 years they had been in Canaan, and still no child. Sarai's barrenness was not just personal grief, but theological crisis. How could the promise advance through her body when her body refused fertility? She made a decision, both practical by ancient standards and devastating in its consequences. She gave Hagar, her Egyptian maidservant, to Abram as a wife. "Go into my servant," she said. "It may be that I shall obtain children by her." Abram listened to the voice of Sarai, and the simple phrase carries weight. Earlier he had listened to the voice of God. Now he listened to the voice of his wife, and human solution was applied to divine promise. Hagar conceived, and with conception came contempt. She looked with disdain on her mistress, her barrenness now exposed and emphasized by the fertility of a servant. The household dynamics twisted into bitterness and recrimination. Sarai, feeling the sting of being supplanted and scorned, turned on Abram. "May the wrong done to me be on you," she cried. "I gave my servant to your embrace." And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. "May the Lord judge between you and me?" Abram's response revealed both his weakness and the terrible position in which competing loyalties placed him. "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." He abdicated responsibility, handed authority back to Sarai, and declined to protect the woman who carried his child. Sarai dealt harshly with Hagar, and the pregnant servant fled into the wilderness, choosing death in the wasteland over life under the hand of her embittered mistress. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" The question invited reflection, recognition of situation and trajectory. "I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai," she said, acknowledging escape but having no destination. "Return to your mistress and submit to her," the angel commanded, but with the command came promise. "I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. You are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hands against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen." Hagar did something remarkable then, something no one else in these narratives does. She gave a name to God. "You are a God of seeing," she said, for she declared, "Have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him?" Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi, the well of the living one who sees me. The Egyptian slave girl, the property without voice, encountered divine attention and responded with theological insight. God saw her, and she saw God, and in that mutual seeing, she found reason to return, to endure, to survive what could not be survived through her own strength. She returned and bore Abram a son, and Abram called him Ishmael, as the angel had commanded. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael. 13 years then passed in silence. 13 years in which the narrative says nothing, in which presumably life continued its daily round. Ishmael grew from infant to boy to young man. Abram aged toward the century mark. Sarai lived with the complicated grief of watching another woman's son grow in her household while her own womb remained closed. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him again and said, "I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly." Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, "Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations." The name change signified transformation and destiny. Abram meant exalted father, a fine name but limited in scope. Abraham meant father of a multitude, a name that embodied promise, that declared future as identity, that made every introduction a proclamation of faith. "I will make you exceedingly fruitful," God continued, "and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you." Then came specification of inheritance. "To you and to your offspring after you I will give the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." Geography entered covenant, divine claim placed upon particular territory, promise not just of descendants, but of homeland for descendants, a where to match the who of future identity. The covenant required a sign, a mark carried in flesh as permanent as the promise it represented. "This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring. After you, every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant. between me and you.
They carried well today.
The practice was not
We
unique
should
to
reach the
Abraham,
altar by noon
but its
tomorrow.
meaning was transformed from cultural custom to theological marker, from ethnic practice to covenant seal. The knife gleams in the early morning sun as Abraham's weathered hand tightens around its handle. The wood is already laid upon the altar, carefully arranged by Isaac's own young hands, each piece positioned with the innocent precision of a son who does not yet understand he was arranging his own funeral pyre. The journey up this mountain has been silent, except for the sound of their footsteps on stone, except for Isaac's single question that still hangs in the air like smoke that will not dissipate. Where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham's answer echoes in his own mind with a weight that threatens to crush him. God will provide himself a lamb, words that contain either the deepest faith or the most desperate hope, or perhaps both intertwined so completely that even Abraham cannot separate them. 3 days earlier, the voice came in the night with a command so incomprehensible that Abraham must have wondered if he had finally descended into madness after all these years. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. The words arrived with crystalline clarity, each syllable a hammer blow against every promise God had ever made. This is the son of promise, the child of laughter, the boy through whom nations were supposed to emerge. This is the miracle child born to a woman past bearing, the fulfillment of decades of waiting, the living proof that God keeps his impossible promises, and now God demands him back, not peacefully in old age, but violently on an altar with fire and knife, and the complete destruction of everything Abraham has built his faith upon. The test is so severe, so absolute, that it seems designed to shatter rather than strengthen. Abraham rose early in the morning. The text gives us this detail with devastating simplicity. No wrestling with God through the night, no argument like he mounted for Sodom, no negotiation or pleading, just obedience so immediate it seems almost mechanical, as though Abraham has moved beyond emotion into some realm where only trust exists. He saddled his donkey, split wood for the burnt offering, took 2 servants and Isaac, and set out for the place God had told him about. The preparations are practical, thorough, impossible. How does a father split wood, knowing it will consume his son? How does he wake that son in the morning, feed him, speak to him, all while carrying the knowledge of what the day will bring? The journey takes 3 days. 3 days of walking beside Isaac, 3 days of watching him, memorizing him, knowing what waits at the end. 3 days in which Abraham could turn back, could choose his son over his God, could decide that surely he misheard, surely God would not demand this. But Abraham keeps walking. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Mount Moriah rises before them, the mountain that will one day hold Solomon's temple, the mountain where heaven and earth seem to meet. Abraham tells the servants to wait. Stay here with the donkey, while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. That plural pronoun carries enormous weight. We will come back. Is this faith or is it deception? Does Abraham believe God will somehow prevent the sacrifice or resurrect Isaac afterward? Or is he simply sparing the servants the horror of what he is about to do? Isaac carries the wood up the mountain on his own shoulders, bearing the instrument of his own death in an image that will echo through centuries, prefiguring another beloved son carrying wood up another hill toward another sacrifice. Abraham carries the fire and the knife. Father and son walk together, and the text gives us that phrase twice as if to emphasize the relationship about to be severed. The wood on Isaac's back grows heavier with each step. His young legs strain under the weight while his father walks beside him, carrying only fire and a blade, and finally the boy speaks, "Abraham, my son." The exchange is tender, intimate, devastating. The fire and wood are here, Isaac says with the logical mind of a child. But where is the lamb for the burnt offering? In this question, the full horror crystallizes. Isaac is thinking through the ritual, anticipating the worship, trying to solve the problem of the missing animal, and he does not realize he is the answer to his own question. Abraham's response is masterful in its ambiguity, profound in its faith, or perhaps its agony. God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. These words can be read multiple ways simultaneously. God will provide the lamb, and that lamb is you, my son. Or God will provide the lambs instead of you, my son. or God will provide something because he must, my son, because I cannot reconcile this command with his character, but I will obey anyway. And they walked on together, father and son, through words that changed nothing and everything, up the mountain toward whatever God has planned. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. His hands stacked stone upon stone with the practiced efficiency of a man who has built many altars over many years. Each stone placed is an act of obedience and an act of dying. He builds carefully, thoroughly, because whatever Abraham is, he is not a man who does things halfway. The altar takes shape, solid and real, and still God has not stopped him. The wood is arranged precisely, exactly as it should be for a burnt offering, and still no angel speaks. No ram appears, no alternative presents itself. Then comes the moment that seems to exist outside time itself. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. The text does not tell us if Isaac struggled or submitted. It does not tell us what words passed between them, if any words were possible at such a moment. The binding of Isaac the Akita. This scene will be painted and sculpted and pondered for millennia, each generation finding new horror and new meaning in the image of a father binding his son. Isaac is young, but not a small child, probably a teenager, old enough to understand, old enough to resist if he chose. Does he submit because he trusts his father, or because he trusts God, or because he is too shocked to comprehend what is happening? Abraham's hands tie the cords around his son's wrists and ankles, hands that once held this baby and marveled at the miracle of him, hands that taught him to walk and to pray, now binding him for slaughter. Isaac lies on the wood, and the sky does not darken, and the earth does not quake, and God remains silent. Abraham reaches out and takes the knife. The blade catches the light as he raises it above his son, above the boy of promise, above the only hope for the future God has promised. This is the moment of absolute surrender, the instant when faith becomes so pure it looks indistinguishable from madness. Abraham has reasoned that God can raise the dead, the writer of Hebrews will later suggest. But in this moment there is no reasoning, only the knife and the trembling hand and the sun and the terrible silence of heaven. Then, exactly when there is no more time, exactly when the blade begins its descent, the voice cracks through the silence like lightning. Abraham, Abraham. The name called twice in urgency, in relief, in triumph. Here I am, Abraham responds, the same words he used when God first called him to this test, and now those words signal the end of the test. Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. The knife stops, the hand trembles and drops, and Abraham must untie his son with shaking fingers, must help him up from the altar, must see in Isaac's eyes whatever this moment has written there. Abraham looks up, and there in a thicket he sees a ram caught by its horns, an animal trapped and waiting, provided exactly when needed, in exactly the place where the knife was about to fall. Abraham takes the ram and offers it on the altar instead of his son, and he calls the place, "The Lord will provide," Yahweh Yireh, a name that becomes a saying repeated whenever someone needs to remember that God provides at exactly the right moment, even when the knife is already raised. On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided, the saying goes. A promise that this mountain where Abraham nearly sacrificed Isaac will become the mountain where God himself will one day provide the final sacrifice, where another father will not stay his hand, where another beloved son will carry wood and die and rise again. But the ram is not the end of the story on Mount Moriah. The angel calls again, this time with a message that takes every promise ever made to Abraham and amplifies it beyond measure. I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this, and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies. And through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me. The covenant is confirmed not with the blood of animals, but with something more precious, with the willingness to give up everything, with faith refined to its absolute essence. Abraham descends the mountain with his son alive beside him, but they are both changed in ways neither will ever fully articulate. The servants are waiting where he left them, and they all return together to Beersheba returned to normal life after the most abnormal day imaginable. But nothing is normal anymore. Abraham has discovered the outer limits of faith, has learned that God can demand anything and must be trusted with everything, has proven that he loves God more than he loves the miraculous son he waited a century to hold. And Isaac has learned something too, has felt the cords and seen the knife, and understood in the most visceral way possible that his life is not his own, that he exists as part of a story larger than himself, that God provides, but the provision often comes at the last possible second after everything seems lost. Years pass and Sarah dies at the age of 127 in Kiriath Arba, which is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Abraham's response to her death reveals how deeply rooted he has become in the promise, despite still living as a foreigner. Sarah lived long enough to see Isaac grow to manhood, long enough to know that the promise would continue, but not long enough to see grandchildren or the multiplication of descendants. Abraham mourns for Sarah and weeps for her, and then he does something remarkable. He goes to the Hittites who own the land and asks to buy a burial site. I am a foreigner and stranger among you, he tells them. Sell me some property for a burial site here so I can bury my dead. The negotiation that follows is elaborate and formal, full of the courtesies and indirections of ancient Near Eastern commerce. The Hittites offer to give Abraham any tomb he wishes, but Abraham insists on purchasing property, on owning it legally and permanently. He wants the cave of Machpelah belonging to Ephron son of Zohar, a cave at the end of Ephron's field. Sell it to me at the full price as a burial site among you. Abraham requests publicly before all the Hittites assembled at the city gate. Ephron responds with apparent generosity, offering to give Abraham both the field and the cave, but Abraham refuses the gift. He weighs out 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants, an enormous sum that indicates this is prime property in a desirable location. Why does Abraham insist on paying such a high price for a burial cave? This is the first purchase of the promised land he will actually own, the first plot of ground in Canaan that belongs legally to him and his descendants. He has been promised the entire land, all of it, from horizon to horizon. But the only part he will own in his lifetime is this cave and the field around it, this small patch of earth, where Sarah will be buried, and where Abraham himself will one day rest, and where Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Leah will all eventually lie. The cave at Machpelah becomes the family tomb, the one permanent possession in a life of tents and temporary dwelling, the down payment on a promise that will take centuries to fulfill. Abraham buries Sarah in the cave and turns his attention to finding a wife for Isaac, because the promise must continue, and Isaac cannot marry a Canaanite woman who will turn his heart to other gods. Abraham calls his chief servant, the one in charge of all that he has, and makes him swear an oath. Put your hand under my thigh, Abraham instructs, using an ancient gesture that invokes the covenant of circumcision that connects this mission to the deepest promises of God. I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I am living, but will go to my country and my own relatives, and get a wife for my son Isaac. The servant raises an obvious question. What if the woman is unwilling to come back with me to this land? Should I then take your son back to the country you came from? Abraham's response is emphatic and revealing. Make sure you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who brought me out of my father's household and my native land, and who spoke to me and promised me on oath, saying to your offspring, I will give this land. He will send his angel before you, so that you can get a wife for my son from there. If the woman is unwilling to come back with you, then you will be released from this oath of mine. Only do not take my son back there. Abraham has come too far, has invested too much faith in the promise of this land, to allow Isaac to return to Mesopotamia. The future lies in Canaan, no matter what, and if a wife must be brought from abroad, then so be it. But Isaac himself must remain in the land of promise. The servant loads 10 camels with all kinds of good things from his master, and sets out for Aram Naharaim, for the town of Nahor in distant Mesopotamia. When he arrives at the town well in the evening as the women come out to draw water, he prays a prayer that reveals how deeply Abraham's faith has shaped his entire household. Lord God of my master Abraham, make me successful today and show kindness to my master Abraham. See, I'm standing beside this spring, and the daughters of the townspeople are coming, out to draw water. May it be that when I say to a young woman, 'Please let down your jar that I may have a drink,' and she says, 'Drink, and I will water your camels too,' let her be the one you have chosen for your servant Isaac. By this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master." Before he has finished praying, Rebekah comes out with her jar on her shoulder. She is the daughter of Bethuel's son, of Milcah, who was the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor, the granddaughter of Abraham's brother, family but not too close, connected to the blessing but not contaminated by Canaanite influence. The text tells us she was very beautiful, a virgin, and as the servant watches her descend into the spring, he sees her fill her jar and come up again. He hurries to meet her and asks for a drink, and her response is immediate and generous. "Drink, my lord," she says, and quickly lowers the jar to her hands and gives him a drink. After he is drunk, she says, "I will draw water for your camels too, until they have had enough to drink." The servant watches her carefully, a man seeking confirmation that this is indeed God's answer. Rebekah empties her jar into the trough and runs back to the well to draw more water, until she has drawn enough for all 10 camels. Camels drink enormous amounts of water after a long journey, sometimes 30 gallons each. Rebekah has just volunteered, will take serious time and effort, has shown not just kindness, but extraordinary generosity and stamina. The servant takes out a gold nose ring weighing a beka and 2 gold bracelets weighing 10 shekels and asks, "Whose daughter are you? Is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night?" She identifies herself as the granddaughter of Nahor and confirms that they have plenty of straw and fodder and room for him to spend the night. Then the servant bows down and worships the Lord. "Praise be to the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his kindness and faithfulness to my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on the journey to the house of my master's relatives." The prayer is spoken before Rebekah, this young woman who knows nothing yet of Abraham or Isaac or the great promises, and she hears a foreign servant praising a God she has not been taught to worship for leading him specifically to her. She runs to tell her mother's household what has happened, and her brother Laban comes out to meet this wealthy servant bearing gold and speaking of God's guidance. At Bethuel's house, the full story emerges. The servant recounts everything: the oath Abraham made him swear, the prayer at the well, Rebekah's exact fulfillment of the sign he asked for, his certainty that God has led him to the right woman. He lays out the wealth of Abraham, tells of Isaac the heir to everything, explains the importance of finding a wife from Abraham's relatives rather than from the Canaanites. Then he asks directly, "Will you show kindness and faithfulness to my master? If so, tell me, and if not, tell me, so I may know which way to turn." Laban and Bethuel answer together, "This is from the Lord. We can say nothing to you one way or the other. Here is Rebekah, take her and go, and let her become the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has directed." But the next morning, when the servant wants to leave immediately, Rebekah's family hesitates. "Let the young woman remain with us 10 days or so, then you may go." The servant is insistent. "Do not detain me now that the Lord has granted success to my journey. Send me on my way so I may go to my master." They decide to ask Rebekah herself to let her choose, and when they call her and ask, "Will you go with this man?" her answer is immediate and decisive: "I will go." Just like that, based on one evening of conversation, based on a servant's story about a God she barely knows and a man she has never met, Rebekah commits to leaving everything familiar and traveling to a foreign land to marry a stranger. Her faith mirrors Abraham's in its willingness to leave home based on a divine promise, its readiness to step into an unknown future because God has indicated the way. They send Rebekah on her way with Abraham's servant and her nurse and her maids, and they bless her, saying, "Our sister, may you increase to thousands upon thousands. May your offspring possess the cities of their enemies." The blessing echoes the promises made to Abraham, extending them now to this young woman who will carry them forward. Rebekah and her attendants mount the camels and follow the servant back toward Canaan, back toward a destiny she can barely imagine. Meanwhile, Isaac has gone out to the field one evening to meditate, and as he looks up, he sees camels approaching. Rebekah looks up and sees Isaac, and when she learns this is the man she has come to marry, she takes her veil and covers herself in the traditional gesture of a bride. The servant tells Isaac all he has done, recounts the prayer and the sign and Rebekah's perfect fulfillment of everything he asked God for. And Isaac brings Rebekah into the tent of his mother Sarah, who has been dead now for 3 years. He marries Rebekah and he loves her, and so Isaac is comforted after his mother's death. The text gives us this tender detail that Isaac's grief for Sarah is finally eased by love for Rebekah, that the son who nearly died on an altar finds healing in the arms of a woman who left everything to join him in the promise. Abraham himself takes another wife after Sarah's death, a woman named Keturah, who bears him 6 more sons, and through them Abraham becomes the ancestor of numerous Arabian tribes. But Abraham gives everything he owns to Isaac, and to the sons of his concubines he gives gifts and sends them away while he is still living, sending them eastward to the land of the east, away from his son Isaac. The inheritance is clear, the line of promise unmistakable. Isaac and Isaac alone receives the covenant blessing, while the other sons receive provisions, but not the promise. Abraham lives to the age of 175 years, having seen Isaac marry and establish his household. Having lived long enough to know the promise will continue through another generation. Then Abraham breathes his last and dies at a good old age, an old man and full of years, and he is gathered to his people. His sons, Isaac and Ishmael, bury him together in the cave of Machpelah, the reconciliation implied in their joint action, the half-brothers united at least in honoring their father. They lay him beside Sarah in the only plot of the promised land he ever owned, the cave he purchased with silver, weighed out in the presence of witnesses, the ground that represents both the fulfillment and the incompleteness of the promise. After Abraham's death, God blesses his son Isaac, who settles near Beer Lahai-roi, the well where the angel found Hagar, the place associated with God who sees. And Isaac too will wait many years for children, will cry out to God on behalf of his barren wife. We'll discover that the pattern of promise delayed is the pattern God has chosen for building this family of faith. Rebekah conceives twins who struggle within her womb, and when she inquires of the Lord, she receives an oracle that will shape the next generation. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. The promise will continue, but not in expected ways, not through the natural order of primogeniture, but through God's surprising choice, through a pattern of election and grace that defies human logic. The aged patriarch stands alone on the mountain path, his shadow elongating in the fading light of day. Behind him, the smoking altar, the ram's blood still fresh upon the stones, the wood that nearly consumed his future, now scattered and silent. Before him, the long descent back to Beersheba, back to Sarah, back to a life forever altered by what transpired on this consecrated ground. But Abraham knows, with a certainty that penetrates to his very marrow, that nothing will ever be the same again. The knife that trembled in his hand, poised above Isaac's throat, has severed more than he could have imagined. It has cut through the final veil between mortal understanding and divine purpose. The consequences of Moriah ripple outward like stones, cast into still water, circles expanding far beyond what any human eye can perceive. Sarah, waiting in their tent, her heart suspended between hope and horror, will hear the footsteps of her returning husband and son, but something in her will break, nonetheless. The rabbinical texts whisper that when Sarah learned how close she came to losing Isaac, her soul departed in that very moment. Whether she died from relief or from the knowledge of what Abraham had been willing to do, the traditions debate endlessly, but this much remains certain. The binding of Isaac binds Sarah too, chains her to a grief that transcends understanding. She who laughed at the impossible promise of a son now weeps at the terrible cost of faith. Abraham buries Sarah in the cave of Machpelah, negotiating with Ephron the Hittite for the first piece of the promised land he will actually own. 400 shekels of silver, weighed out in the presence of witnesses, the first real estate transaction in the family that will become Israel. The irony does not escape him. God promised him all the land from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates, yet the only plot he possesses is a burial cave, purchased at full price, a place to lay his dead. The gap between promise and possession yawns like a chasm, and Abraham finds himself standing on its edge, looking across to a future he will never personally inhabit. But the test on Moriah has accomplished something profound. something that reverberates through the corridors of time. Abraham has demonstrated that the covenant demands everything, yet God requires not the sacrifice of children, but the surrender of control. This paradox becomes the foundation upon which an entire theology will be built. The God of Abraham does not desire human sacrifice, even as he demands absolute devotion. He does not consume the future, even as he claims every moment of the present. This distinction will separate the religion of Abraham's descendants from the dark practices of surrounding nations, where children were indeed offered to Moloch and Baal, where the fires consumed real flesh, where no ram appeared in the thicket. The binding of Isaac becomes, in Jewish tradition, the Akedah, the ultimate act of binding between God and humanity. It transforms into a merit that Isaac's descendants can claim across generations, a demonstration of loyalty so profound that it echoes through history. When later Israel faces judgment, the Akedah is remembered. When prayers seem to go unanswered, the Akedah is invoked. Abraham's willingness becomes a kind of spiritual currency, a deposit in the cosmic bank of divine mercy. The altar on Moriah, tradition claims, stands on the very spot where the temple will one day rise, where sacrifices will be offered for centuries, where the presence of God will dwell among his people. The connection is not accidental. The place of Abraham's greatest test becomes the place of Israel's greatest worship. Isaac himself emerges from this experience transformed, though the texts give us only glimpses of his inner life. He is not the last son almost sacrificed, nor the first, but he may be the only one who understood in that moment of supreme terror that his father's hand was stayed by something greater than paternal love. Isaac will become the quietest of the patriarchs, the most passive, the one who digs wells rather than conquering cities, who mediates rather than confronts. Some see this as weakness, but perhaps it is wisdom. Perhaps Isaac understands, in ways Abraham never fully grasped, that survival itself is a form of testimony. He lives because God wills it, not because he deserved it or earned it. This knowledge shapes everything that follows. Abraham, in his final years, takes another wife, Keturah, and fathers more children. Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua become the fathers of nations themselves, spreading across the Arabian Peninsula, their descendants eventually encountering the children of Isaac in ways both peaceful and violent. But Abraham, with the clarity of approaching death, understands the distinction. He gives gifts to these sons of his concubine and sends them away eastward to the east country, while Isaac alone receives the inheritance. The covenant cannot be divided or diluted. It passes through a single line, chosen not by merit but by divine election. This principle of selection, arbitrary to human eyes but purposeful in the divine plan, becomes a source of both comfort and controversy for millennia to come. The death of Abraham arrives quietly, without drama or divine intervention. He simply breathes his last, old and full of years, and is gathered to his people. The phrase carries weight beyond euphemism. Abraham joins not just his ancestors in death, but the fellowship of those who walked by faith, who believed in promises beyond their comprehension, who died without seeing the fulfillment, yet clung to the vision nonetheless. His burial reunites him with Sarah in the cave of Machpelah, and in a moment of profound reconciliation, Isaac and Ishmael together lay their father to rest. The half-brothers, separated by jealousy and destiny, come together in grief, united by the shared experience of having Abraham as father. However differently that relationship manifested in their lives, the revelation that emerges from Abraham's story is not simple or comfortable. It speaks to the nature of divine selection and human response to the mystery of election and the burden of chosenness. Why Abraham? The question haunts the narrative because no clear answer ever emerges. He is presented as particularly righteous before his calling, not distinguished by great deeds or moral superiority. He is simply chosen, called, elected for purposes that transcend his individual merit or understanding. This uncomfortable truth challenges every human system of justice and fairness. If God's choice is arbitrary, how can we protest when we are not chosen? If his purposes are inscrutable, how can we trust his goodness? Yet the story refuses to let us settle into simple fatalism. Abraham's faith, while credited to him as righteousness, is not passive acceptance. It is active engagement, questioning, arguing, negotiating with God. When God declares his intention to destroy Sodom, Abraham does not bow and accept. He challenges, bargains, pushes back against divine decree. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? The question is not rhetorical. Abraham demands accountability even from God, establishing a tradition of chutzpah that will characterize Jewish relationship with the divine for all time. He loses the argument. Sodom burns. Lot barely escapes, but the principle is established. Faith does not require the surrender of moral reasoning or ethical questioning. The legacy of Abraham extends far beyond his immediate descendants. 3 great monotheistic religions claim him as father, each interpreting his story through different theological lenses, each finding in his life justification for their particular understanding of divine truth. For Judaism, Abraham is the first Jew, the one who discovered God through reason and revelation, who entered into covenant through circumcision, who established the pattern of Torah observance even before Torah was given. The tradition imagines Abraham as the first iconoclast, smashing his father Terah's idols, rejecting the polytheism of prediscovering monotheism through philosophical inquiry and divine encounter. He becomes the exemplar of the righteous convert, the one who chose God even when tradition and family pulled in other directions. For Christianity, Abraham's significance lies primarily in his faith, his willingness to trust God's promise against all evidence, to believe that from his aged body and Sarah's dead womb would come nations and kings. Paul, writing to early Christian communities, holds up Abraham as the prototype of justification by faith, arguing that Abraham was counted righteous not through works or law, but through belief alone. The chronology matters to Paul's argument. Abraham believed, and it was credited to him as righteousness before he was circumcised, before he received any law, before he performed any ritual. Faith precedes and supersedes religious observance. Paul argues, making Abraham the father not just of Jews by blood, but of all who believe, regardless of ethnic origin or ceremonial status. For Islam, Abraham, or Ibrahim, stands as one of the greatest prophets, the friend of God, the one who rebuilt the Kaaba in Mecca with his son Ishmael, establishing the pilgrimage rites that Muslims observe to this day. Islamic tradition emphasizes Abraham's absolute submission to God's will, his total surrender, which is the very meaning of Islam. The story of the near sacrifice appears in the Quran, though Islamic tradition often identifies the son as Ishmael rather than Isaac. Placing the event in the context of Abraham's relationship with Hagar and their son, elevating the line that Jewish tradition marginalizes. The differences matter, but so does the common thread. All 3 traditions see in Abraham a model of radical faith, of willingness to sacrifice everything for divine purpose. This multi-faith claim on Abraham has generated both unity and conflict across centuries. He becomes a point of connection, a shared ancestor who theoretically should unite rather than divide. Interfaith dialogues invoke Abrahamic heritage, seeking common ground in the patriarch's tent, hoping that shared origins might translate to peaceful coexistence. Yet the very disagreements about how to interpret Abraham's legacy, which son carried the promise, what faith means and requires, have fueled theological disputes that sometimes erupted into violence. The land Abraham walked, the ground where he pitched his tents, remains contested territory, claimed by descendants both literal and spiritual, each insisting their interpretation represents the authentic continuation of his covenant. Abraham's story also reveals uncomfortable truths about the nature of promise and fulfillment. God's covenant with Abraham included specific, measurable promises, descendants, land, blessing to nations. Yet Abraham himself sees only the barest fulfillment. He has one legitimate son through Sarah, plus Ishmael, plus the sons of Keturah, hardly the multitude that would outnumber the stars or sand. He owns no land except a burial cave. The nations of his day do not bless themselves by him, but view him as a strange wanderer, a wealthy alien who worships a god they have never heard of. If Abraham measures success by conventional standards, he dies a failure, his dreams unfulfilled, his legacy uncertain. But this gap between promise and possession becomes itself a theological statement. Faith, Abraham's life declares, is not about immediate gratification or quick fulfillment. It is about trusting in purposes that extend beyond a single lifetime, about planting trees whose shade you will never enjoy, about building foundations for structures you will never inhabit. Abraham lives as a stranger in the land God promised him, dwelling in tents while Canaanites live in cities, never settling, never claiming ownership except for that one cave. His homelessness becomes a spiritual metaphor. Those who walk by faith are always, in some sense, aliens and strangers, living toward a future they can glimpse but not grasp, believing in promises that transcend their temporal circumstances. The covenant itself, that central reality of Abraham's existence, remains mysterious in its mechanisms and implications. How exactly does God's promise work? Is it unconditional, or does it require ongoing human cooperation? Can it be voided by disobedience, or is it eternally secured by divine commitment? The text offers evidence for multiple interpretations. God's initial call seems unconditional, a unilateral declaration of intent. But the covenant ceremony in Genesis 15, with its divided animals and smoking firepot, suggests a bilateral agreement, a treaty requiring faithfulness from both parties. The command to walk before God and be blameless implies ongoing moral obligation. Yet when Abraham fails, when he deceives kings about Sarah, when he takes Hagar at Sarah's suggestion, the covenant stands firm, unshaken by human weakness. Perhaps this ambiguity is itself the point. Covenant with God is not a simple contract with clear terms and conditions. It is a relationship, complex and dynamic, requiring trust even when the terms seem unclear, demanding faithfulness even when the obligations appear contradictory. Abraham's greatest descendants will wrestle with this same tension. Israel at Sinai will receive the law, codifying the covenant's expectations, yet will repeatedly violate those terms, while God repeatedly renews commitment. The tension between divine sovereignty and human responsibility, between unconditional promise and conditional blessing, runs like a fault line through all subsequent biblical theology, and it originates here in God's mysterious dealings with Abraham. The transformation of Abraham's identity also carries profound significance. He begins as Abram, exalted father, and becomes Abraham, father of multitudes. The change is not merely cosmetic. In ancient Near Eastern thought, names contain essence, define identity, shape destiny. When God renames Abraham, he is not just giving him a new title, but reconstituting his very being, redefining his purpose, expanding his identity beyond anything Abram could have imagined. Similarly, Sarai becomes Sarah, both meaning princess, but the change itself signifies transformation. They are not the same people who left Ur or even who entered Canaan. The journey has remade them. The covenant has reforged their identities, binding them to a purpose larger than their personal desires or ambitions. This pattern of renaming, of identity transformation through divine encounter, echoes through biblical history. Jacob becomes Israel after wrestling with God. Simon becomes Peter, the rock. Saul becomes Paul. In each case, the new name signifies a new calling, a new identity forged through encounter with the divine. Abraham establishes the template. To enter into covenant with God is to have your identity fundamentally altered, to become someone new, someone whose life is no longer entirely your own, but is caught up in purposes that transcend individual existence. The wealth Abraham accumulates also deserves attention. He is not a poor nomad struggling to survive. He is by any standard rich. He travels with hundreds of servants, owns vast flocks and herds, possesses silver and gold, commands respect from local kings. This prosperity is presented as blessing, fulfillment of God's promise to bless him. Yet Abraham's wealth does not insulate him from struggle or testing. It does not prevent Sarah's infertility, or Hagar's bitterness, or Isaac's near death. If anything, his wealth creates new complications, new responsibilities, new potential points of failure. The prosperity gospel, which imagines faith as a path to material success, finds little support in Abraham's actual experience. He is blessed, yes, but his blessings come packaged with profound challenges that wealth cannot solve. The famous hospitality scene, where Abraham entertains 3 visitors who turn out to be divine messengers, establishes another enduring legacy. Abraham sees strangers approaching in the heat of the day and runs to meet them, bows to the ground, insists they stay, has Sarah prepare bread, personally selects a choice calf for slaughter, stands by while they eat. The elaborate welcome, the generous provision, the personal involvement in serving guests, becomes the model of hospitality that Jewish tradition will elevate to one of the highest virtues. These visitors bring news of Isaac's coming birth, and Sodom's coming destruction, demonstrating that hospitality to strangers may mean entertaining angels unaware. That the stranger at your tent door might carry messages that change your destiny. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, connected to Abraham's story through Lot, raises troubling questions about divine judgment and collective punishment. Abraham's negotiation with God over the cities introduces the concept of the righteous remnant, the idea that even a small number of righteous people might spare an entire community from judgment. The decreasing numbers, from 50 to 45 to 40 to 30 to 20 to 10, show both God's mercy and the reality of Sodom's depravity. Not even 10 righteous can be found, yet Lot and his family are extracted before judgment falls. The principle emerges that God does not simply destroy en masse without regard for the innocent, yet neither does he allow evil to continue indefinitely unchecked. Lot's wife, turning back and becoming a pillar of salt, adds a haunting footnote. She is not given a name, not accorded a voice, yet her action speaks volumes. What did she see when she looked back? Was it simply the cities burning? Or was it her entire life, everything familiar, all she knew and loved being consumed in divine fire? The command not to look back requires a kind of psychological amputation, a willingness to sever connection with the past completely, to walk toward an unknown future without the comfort of backward glances. Her failure to obey, whether from nostalgia or doubt or simple human curiosity, costs her everything. She becomes a monument to the dangers of divided loyalty, of trying to move forward while remaining attached to what must be left behind. Abraham's intercession for Sodom reveals another dimension of his character. He is not content to simply accept God's declared intentions. He argues, negotiates, pushes for mercy. This establishes the role of the intercessor, the one who stands between divine judgment and human sinfulness, pleading for mercy, seeking to avert catastrophe. Moses will later take up this role at Sinai when the golden calf provokes God's wrath. The prophets will intercede for Israel repeatedly. Jesus is understood by Christians as the ultimate intercessor, standing between God and humanity. But Abraham pioneers this position, demonstrating that relationship with God includes the responsibility to plead for others, to use whatever influence one has to seek mercy for those who may not deserve it. The consequences of Abraham's choices continue to unfold across generations. Isaac fathers Esau and Jacob, twins who struggle with each other from the womb, representing two nations locked in conflict. Jacob, the deceiver, becomes Israel through his own night of wrestling with God, fathering 12 sons who become the tribes of Israel. But the family dysfunction continues. Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers. The entire clan ends up in Egypt, where blessing turns to bondage. The promises given to Abraham seem to recede further with each generation, yet God's commitment never wavers. The covenant maintains its hold across centuries of slavery, through exodus and wilderness, through conquest and kingdom, through exile and return. The land promise, so central to God's covenant with Abraham, remains contested and complicated. The boundaries are described from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates, an area never fully controlled, even at the height of David and Solomon's united kingdom. Is the promise still unfulfilled, waiting for some future realization? Has it been fulfilled in ways that don't require literal political control? Different traditions answer differently, and these answers have real-world consequences in contemporary geopolitics. The land Abraham walked, where he built altars and dug wells, where he buried Sarah and was himself buried, remains at the center of conflicts that invoke his name and claim his legacy. Abraham's encounter with Melchizedek, priest of God Most High, introduces another mysterious element. Who is this king of Salem, this priest without genealogy, who blesses Abraham and receives tithes from him? The text offers no explanation of his origins or legitimacy, yet Abraham acknowledges his authority, accepts his blessing, gives him a tenth of everything. Later biblical interpretation makes much of this encounter. The psalm declares God's promise that the coming king will be a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek, combining political and religious authority in ways the Levitical priesthood does not. The New Testament book of Hebrews develops this extensively, arguing that Jesus' priesthood supersedes the Levitical order because it follows Melchizedek's pattern. But in Abraham's moment, It is simply a strange encounter, a blessing received from an unexpected source, another reminder that God's purposes involve players and patterns Abraham cannot fully understand. The circumcision mandate, given as the sign of the covenant, establishes a physical mark that will distinguish Abraham's descendants. This is not merely symbolic. It is painful, permanent, and in the ancient world, culturally distinctive. It marks Isaac and every male descendant as belonging to something specific, as bound to a particular covenant with a particular God. The practice becomes so central to Jewish identity that during periods of persecution, when circumcision was forbidden, Jews risked death to maintain it. The mark in the flesh becomes a test of loyalty, a visible sign of invisible commitment, a permanent reminder of covenant identity. As Abraham's story draws to its close, his legacy remains ambiguous. He has one son through Sarah, a burial cave in Canaan, the memory of divine promises, and a covenant marked in flesh. By any worldly measure, this is insufficient. Yet the text insists that Abraham died satisfied, old and full of years, gathered to his people. His satisfaction cannot derive from visible success or tangible fulfillment. It must come from something else. The assurance that God's promises, however delayed, however invisible, however improbable, are certain. Abraham dies believing that what God has spoken will come to pass, even if he never sees it personally. The Tower of Babel, which precedes Abraham's call in the biblical narrative, provides crucial context. Humanity, united in language and ambition, attempts to build a tower reaching heaven, to make a name for themselves, to resist the divine command, to spread and fill the earth. God confuses their language, scatters them across the world, fragmenting human unity. Into this fractured world, Abraham is called. The irony is profound. Humanity sought to make a name for itself and was scattered. Abraham is promised that God will make his name great, and through him all the scattered peoples will be blessed. The way to genuine significance, the narrative suggests, is not through self-promotion but through submission to divine purpose. The route to becoming a blessing is not through asserting your importance, but through accepting your calling. Abraham's story also functions as a critique of idolatry, though this is more explicit in later Jewish tradition than in the Genesis text itself. The Midrash imagines young Abraham reasoning his way to monotheism, recognizing that the sun, moon, and stars worshipped by others are themselves created things, concluding there must be one creator behind all phenomena. Whether or not this philosophical journey is historical, it represents an important aspect of Abraham's legacy. He is the one who sees past the immediate to the ultimate, past the visible gods to the invisible God, past the many to the one. This insight, this recognition of a single divine source behind all reality, transforms human thought and provides the foundation for ethical monotheism. The question of Abraham's righteousness continues to provoke reflection. He is far from morally perfect. He lies about Sarah twice. He takes Hagar and then allows her mistreatment. He seems willing to sacrifice Isaac with little protest, yet argued extensively for Sodom. He is, in other words, deeply human, flawed and inconsistent, sometimes noble and sometimes cowardly. Yet God chooses him, works through him, credits his faith as righteousness. This too is part of Abraham's legacy, the demonstration that God's purposes are not dependent on human perfection, that covenant is not earned through flawless performance, that relationship with God is possible for broken, complicated, morally ambiguous human beings. If Abraham had to be perfect for God to use him, the covenant would have died with him. Instead, it survives and flourishes precisely because God's faithfulness does not require human perfection. In the end, Abraham's life testifies to the possibility of a different way of being human in the world, not rooted in one place, but willing to wander at divine direction, not trusting in visible securities, but believing in invisible promises, not demanding immediate fulfillment, but walking in faith toward distant horizons, not seeking self-made glory, but accepting a given purpose, not clinging to the past, but moving toward an unknown future, not sacrificing children to appease the gods, but trusting that God requires surrender rather than slaughter, that he provides rather than simply demands. The Father of Nations leaves behind not a kingdom or empire, but a faith, not a territory conquered, but a promise received, not monuments and palaces, but a family carrying divine purpose into the future. His tomb in Machpelah becomes a place of pilgrimage for millennia, a reminder that what matters most cannot be measured in conventional terms. The promises God made to him continue to reverberate through history, claimed by billions who trace their spiritual ancestry to this wanderer from Ur who heard a voice and obeyed, who believed God and had it credited to him as righteousness, who walked before God even when the path led through shadows. Standing now in imagination at Abraham's graveside, beside Isaac and Ishmael reconciled in grief, we recognize that his story is not finished. It continues in every person who hears a call and responds, who believes promises against evidence, who walks by faith rather than sight, who trusts in purposes larger than personal understanding. Abraham's legacy is not primarily biological but spiritual, not genetic but theological. He fathers nations not merely through physical descent, but through the transmission of faith, the demonstration that life lived in response to divine calling, however imperfectly, however partially fulfilled, has meaning that transcends mortality. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is not a philosophical abstraction, but the God who enters human history, who makes promises and keeps them across generations, who binds himself to finite humans through covenant, who does not abandon his purposes even when we fail. Abraham's life reveals this God, not comprehensively but sufficiently, not exhaustively but truly. And in revealing God, Abraham also reveals what it means to be human before God, vulnerable yet dignified, flawed yet chosen, mortal yet connected to eternal purposes, walking always between promise and fulfillment, between call and destination, between what is and what will be. The Father of Nations teaches us that greatness is measured not by what we accomplish in our lifetime, but by what we set in motion for generations beyond our sight. That significance comes not from building towers to heaven, but from responding to heaven's call. Earth, that blessing flows not from grasping, but from surrendering, not from asserting, but from trusting, not from demanding, but from believing. In the tent of Abraham, all who would walk by faith find welcome. At the altar of Abraham, all who would surrender to divine purpose find their sacrifice transformed. In the covenant of Abraham, all who would believe discover that faith, however imperfect, is credited as righteousness. And so the story concludes where it begins, with a call that echoes still across millennia, inviting each generation to leave familiar territory for unknown destinations, to believe in promises that seem impossible, to walk by faith through a world that demands visible proof, to become part of a story larger than any individual life, to join the caravan that began with one man from Ur who heard the voice of God and said yes, setting in motion purposes that will not be complete until all nations are indeed blessed, until the promise is fulfilled, until faith gives way to sight and the children of Abraham, in all their multitudes, finally come home.